Welcome to the Water People podcast. Derek Hynd is a former world tour surfer, a prolific writer, and he's been at the forefront of the finless fiberglass approach to wave riding. He's a quirky philosopher of the surfing life, always with a finger to the pulse of global surf happenings, and he's got a life's worth of stories to add depth and texture to his musings on all things surfing. We had Derek over for a late lunch last autumn and sat on the floor amongst our boys' scattered blocks to delve into Derek's world and talk about the nature of objectivity, the gender performance gap, and Dora's spastic style. Those are his words, not mine.
Spasmodic.
Spasmodic, that's what it was.
Yeah. Derek Hynd. There is only one. What a mind. You know how they talk about like when people lose one sense, other senses gain strength and pick up the slack? You know, I didn't know Derek before he lost the sight in his eye, one of his eyes. But I'm sure he was sharp as a tack then. But it seems like since the loss of that sight, his mind has just picked up that energy that was sent to that eye, and now is just such a sharp observer of anything he's interested in. Like, you want to talk about music, orchestral music, or any arrangement, Derek is ready to roll. If you want to talk about finance or architecture or cultural developments, wherever he's travelled, he's just there ready to roll with you.
Isn't he the ultimate antidote to the dumb surfer stereotype?
Yes,
I feel like Derek is just he's so ready to converse on such an informed level on so many different things.
And really appreciating the brain that's not been obliterated by mass drug and alcohol consumption, given that he grew through the 80s and 70s, 80s and 90s in Australian surf culture, which is pretty much as hedonistic as it gets.
Yeah, he's one of our precious elders of surf culture that we really wanted to loop into this project. And I was really excited to talk to him about women's surfing, because no one ever asks Derek about women's surfing, but he, of course, lived and surfed alongside so many women through the 80s and 90s, and got to watch the progression of women's surfing, women's professional surfing unfold. And I knew from little snippets of conversation that we'd had in the past that he had a very particular take on the reason for the performance gap between men and women in surfing, and he boils it down to one singular factor, and I found that really exciting, really interesting.
His conceptual mind right now bubbling up about completely revolutionary ways to gather surfers for semi-rebel toury kind of concept, something that's inclusive and elevates everyone instead of exclusive and just brings one person to the top of the heap. Just shows how much he cares, how much he's watching, and how much he's dreaming of a really bright, beautiful and balanced surfing future.
Yeah.
And culture.
I think you're getting ahead of us a little bit too far. We'll step away and let you all listen to Derek's wise words, and we hope you enjoy. Thanks. The Water People podcast is brought to you by the fine folks at Sanuk. They craft the comfiest footwear around and have been advocates for a more playful and inclusive surfing culture for more than 2 decades. Thanks, Sanuk, for your support and for encouraging water people around the globe to protect their happy places. Learn more about Sanuk's partnership with the Surfrider Foundation at sanuk.com. Thanks also to Gary McNeil Concepts for their support in making the podcast possible. Gary McNeil shapes some of the quirkiest boards around and is constantly innovating with new board materials like hemp and flax to reduce the petrochemical footprint of his boards. Learn more at garymcneilconcepts.com.au.
So, Derek, we are sitting on our property on a late autumn, early winter's day, and we've had an interesting run of swell and in-between type of waves, nothing overly celebrated, but a lot of great windows in the water. And our encounter with you at the beach the other day was really, as always, fascinating and something that got our minds sort of ticking over and wondering, what's happening in the world of Derek Hynd at the moment, and in particular, that one question that we've been enjoying asking people which is, do you have a story of a time in your life where you had an experience where you were never the same after as a water person?
Yeah, when Lauren put that to me an hour or so before that lovely lunch, it came to me in an easy millisecond about losing my eye or the sight of it. But, that's July 27, 1980, and there's a lot of water under the bridge since then. I've probably changed 10 times over. Moreover, just in the past week, there have been gannets upon gannets upon gannets at the pass. And they're my favourite bird by so far on the whole planet. I try to point out to as many people as possible that that bird is probably responsible for more of 20th century aviation than any scientist. From the F-111 in Vietnam to the Concorde. And if there's a long enough lull, I'll explain to somebody the moment at Jeffreys Bay when people were just mesmerised. Surfers, non-surfers were just barely catching waves if they were surfers and just staring to the sky if they weren't. Hundreds of gannets had gathered. This is in about, 88 during the sardine run. We didn't even know the sardines were coming through, but there they were, and here came the gannets in the days when sea life and bird life just flourished. So it was a rampage of unstructured bedlam for about 20 minutes, just swing wing diving gannets, just picking up speed, just diving and getting fat and then just sitting there so stuffed they couldn't fly. Kind of half an hour went by and then they started taking off again, and it was almost a scene out of the Twilight Zone, a perfect blue sky day, and they started traversing a spiral path about 100 metres up into the air, hundreds of these birds, and then at the tip of the vortex, one would just spiral through the vacuum. And then they'd just start this spiral, and it went for about 20 minutes again. I just got shivers just remembering it. It was perfection in nature. Never seen it before or since. The reason why I probably bring that up is because witnessing repetitious occurrences at supposedly the world's greatest point break does get a little bit mundane. It's just the rare things that you remember, but you don't really know how to place them until something happens. And for me, at the moment where things started to get put together logically for where I was trying to get at with my surfing, was when Satu Vanska, who's Richard Tognetti's partner and the deputy lead of the Australian Chamber Orchestra, were with me on King Island. Great friends of Wire's as well. And I asked Satu about her family, missionaries in Japan. She grew up unbelievably on the island of Shikoku, where the greatest river mouths on the planet are. And when I pointed out how close by Mono Bay River was, which to this day is the greatest surf of my life, it was just a wonderful circle completed. She had several siblings, and I asked in turn what every one of them was doing. She got to her younger brother, who is a theoretical physicist. And I went, oh yeah, that's interesting. What's his construct? And she said, oh, well, her voice is so, oh, well, Derek, it is something about far field theory. It is what happens as you hit infinity. It's a thesis that only one person on the planet could understand and award him his doctorate. And I was going, whoa, I'd love to at least look at it to see what it means. And she went, oh, well, It's all kind of gobbledygook, except the first page is interesting. So anyway, I eventually got a hold of it and read the greatest one page of my life. He'd dumbed it down so much for layman, I guess, intellectuals to understand, that all of a sudden he dumbed it down way too far and I could understand it. I distinctly remember saying to Satu, but he's describing life and death. Don't you realize he's describing what happens at the point of death? Reaching infinity and reaching death are one at the same. And she went, maybe you're right. And the construct was as basic as this. Lives go through chaos. Doesn't matter whose life it is. Everyone's life goes through chaos. But eventually, everything comes together at its most chaotic. And again, that could be describing the point of death as well. So the far-field theory depicts how this mass unscrambling at the point of infinity suddenly just goes and enters infinity in perfection. Yeah, and getting back to what I'd been doing for a few years anyway without fins, I'd already called it free friction because of going to the Daytona 500 and watching a car on the speed bank that was 66, number 66, because that's where I was living in Sydney, where I grew up. And from the middle of the pack, it got to the front. And before it wiped out at 200 miles an hour, it went 201. I could see it go 201 because it lost it with 3 cars up its arse, like right up its arse. And you could see it do a highline drift, and you could see it gap the rest of the cars before they had time to even brake. And then it went end over end. Uncannily, Curran was on the other side of the track. When I tried to tell him about what I'd seen at Daytona Beach, he just said to me, green car? Which was 66. Incredible. But yeah, at that point, I realized that it's these really small incremental moments that matter far more in surfing than the bigger picture.
The gannets.
The gannets, what they were achieving in almost like a collective consciousness. We've had our desperate feed, now let's work as a unit. And just say at Jeffries, when the surf does get a marauding size, and marauding usually means it can be just 4 feet, but with the devil wind running up, that really breaks boards, and there's just a massive chatter on the face, or it can be 8 feet. There's a very famous photo taken of Jeffries in the late 60s of the most beautiful, beastly waves running down the empty point, but you can see the devil wind is right into it, 8 to 10 feet, just about unrideable. Maybe TF in his glory days on a sunset gun could do it justice. I remember catching one wave when the wind was like that in the early morning, and it was just, say, 6 feet on the outside, and then was a grower through the impossible section. And getting to the point of Daytona and the far field, I might have wanted to flick off, but I couldn't. I was just completely locked into a high line, chattering across the face. I was aware that I was going faster than I should have been going. I was aware that my mouth was getting wider and wider open because I could feel the nor'wester just running down my throat. But still I was going faster. And it was the sense of, wow, everything's going to be fine. Whereas it should have been completely chaotic. It's kind of breaking through something that otherwise I wouldn't have had a clue about. Since then, I guess minimalism has been reinforced more and more. I don't really run towards trying to do whatever massive turn could be done rather than finding the line of a bird, I guess. Dolphins are well known at J Bay, sharks are well known at J Bay, but those birds, when they decide to take a look at you from just above, you've probably seen it heaps, and just peer down without any bend of the wings, and then just move off. It's godlike. It's their knowledge that could never quite be imparted, but they've seen something, and I am of no consequence to what they've just seen. It's just perfectly non-judgmental. If they could apply thought to me, they'd probably think useless.
Yeah. That's often what I feel when I see creatures in that element thriving and us flailing, typically, in their eyes, you know? Like we have a pod of dolphins that live right here, resident pod, behind our property that we always see pretty much every time we go and surf. They're there, big family of females and young ones. And it's that feeling every time, just that feeling of absolute perfect design in that medium. It's so great.
This is kind of chicken or the egg stuff, but my two most memorable fish experiences have been of sharks, in which I've known that the shark is so tuned into the force of a wave from cruising in deep water, coming at me, not to attack, but to do a reverse fade and back onto the shallower part, so that I'm from me to you away with it bent over, membrane folded. It ended up attacking the next guy down the line when I didn't make the wave. But just in those slowed down moments of wow, I distinctly remember thinking, beyond dolphin. And then at the pass, intriguing. I don't know if it's happened to you guys, but it's happened twice. One in particular where about 1.5 meter shark on a perfectly groomed bank on a day like this, just so pristine, was underneath me following my every turn without delay. There was no semblance of, there he goes. He was just with me all the way, but so low down, I swear I could see a trail of sand coming off it, which would have been its shtick, you know. It was just rubbing itself to kingdom come, whilst at the same time getting a trippy slingshot. I don't know what was happening from there to there, but went for about 100 metres. I wonder what that shark is. Just absolutely fascinating. Kind of a Casper shark, Casper the friendly shark.
Instantly a question comes to my mind then. So you started with the story of losing the sight in your eye. Do you feel that when that happened, you became more observant in the world because you had less to use with your sight? Or before that, were you always this observant? Because I'm sure many surfers encounter gannets, many surfers ride with rays, fish, dolphins, all kinds of sharks, everything underneath them on waves, but not that many surfers would recall those observations. So, yeah, that's my question. Was that a line where that changed you when that happened in that way, or not so much?
Well, instantly, from the moment of impact of the fin and swallow, because of the leg rope, on a very shallow bank, falling down seemed to take about 10 seconds, when it probably took half a second. And I mapped out what I was going to do in the next year by the time I hit the water. That map wasn't a pretty map. It was, well, I'm just going to prove that it's no fluke that I'm here and do it again. A very guttural, linear perspective. And, I mean, the likes of Sean Thompson, the imperious Sean, not necessarily casting an aspersion in calling him imperialist, but my goodness me, there were about 3 or 4 surfers through the late 70s who had or tried to have an imperious attitude. Sean, about 5 or 6 years later, when my first Top 44 review came out for Surfer magazine, wrote an incredibly pissed off letter, short, to Surfer. They published it. And Sean squarely laid the blame for my biting cynicism towards the sad horror I'd obviously felt from my accident, and that the public should take pity on my writing because of it. But I was kind of always on the outside looking in anything I ever did. From the age of about 11, when I couldn't swim, and I was always looking to where the flags were so that I could be sure to jump off my Kool-Aid onto the sandbar and not get swept out. So I was looking that way. There was also being young for my age in class and seeing a lot of my friends one morning choose drugs instead of lighting fires before school with your dog, and going to school all smoky of firewood instead of weed. Outside looking in there, and definitely outside looking in when I started becoming aware of the subjectivity of the contest system, which to this day has not one iota improved. Arguably, it was better way back when I was 17 in 74 because of the leeway that judges had without being marshalled by the head judge, the leeway they had in being able to feel the art in a ride rather than just looking at the turns. Yeah, but it's funny. The loss of my sight made Joe Engel the happiest man ever, because whenever we'd be on a trip, he'd be cracking faces at me, going like that at me when I'm just driving along like that. And then eventually I'd just hear the funniest laugh in the world, because he used to call me derelict. He'd just be screaming with laughter at the end. Derelict, derelict.
Joe Engel is an amazing surfer, Lauren, who was from Burleigh Heads area where I was a grommet. And when I was under the tutelage of Dick Van.
Oh, there you go.
Dick Van was also his shaper and larrikin mentor, or whatever you want to call
Thornton and Joe.
Yeah, Thornton and Joe.
And Joe had, like Dane Kealoha, the thumb up of his leading hand when he was in the barrel. And it was quite intimidating.
Yeah, an immovable stance. He was rock solid.
Derek, you were speaking a little bit about subjectivity in the process of judging surfing. What's your feeling about objectivity in general? Do you think it's ever really attainable?
The Roman mob probably had objectivity down to a T. And the senators and the emperor had to pay attention to the collective viewpoint. That said, it's kind of run away. We were speaking a little bit off microphone about trolling on the net. It's escaped objectivity in that sense. But the pullback to that is in the surfing sense of people's comments. Just about every comment you read, no matter how horrible, has a semblance, a modicum of truth about it. It's frightening how splayed open the world has become at one end, but how insular and conservative it's become right-wing, in right-wing mannerisms on the other. It reeks of there being no foundation. In the surfing sense, from doing work with Jack, Blue Horizon and Deeper Shade of Blue, we always tried to ferret around for as much footage as we could get of the early Makaha meets, because it seemed to us that this was the friendly event. This is where surfing reached a marriage of, egalitarianism. Perhaps at its crescendo when the organiser agreed to postpone the end of a day until the very end because the Australians, of whom Midget was one, arrived late. And that's when they just threw a bunch of Australians in the one heat at the end of the day, which ended up giving Midget his run right through to win the event. Objectively, One of the most objective things in surfing right now can be seen at the pass on any day. And that is that despite the crowd, despite the bedlam, despite the danger, despite the leashes when people are crying for no leashes, despite the no leashes when people are crying for leashes, you will still see 5% of the people out there riding the waves of their life. And that's objectivity about surfing. But saying that, given that that's basically people a week or a year into surfing, it doesn't say much about people 30, 50, 60 years into the game.
Of which most aren't in that lineup because their heads will pop.
Well, one has to cut a swathe across the bow of Bob McTavish. Giving him his due as being a great innovator and thinker is one thing, but creating the opportunity for a mass generation of people to come back into surfing when they'd all given up and gone to sea it in the mid-'80s. And with Nat Young, then absolutely perpetuating the majesty of it all by putting in the most astonishing performances on essentially horrible bits of equipment. That's led us to where we are now, particularly at somewhere like the Pass, where it becomes a field of dreams for people on inept equipment and limited performance. But hey, like I said, objectively phenomenal.
I would say that it teeters on that infinity theory that you were touching on earlier too. That chaos right to the point where you're then that person on that wave.
That is funny because, generally speaking, I will try and say to 4 or 5 people per surf, you do realise that the best section's mid to bottom and there's no one down there. And that describes cutting through the chaos and all of a sudden you've just got that whoa.
Yes, which is the same that every point break dynamic on the planet pretty much adheres to.
Oh, it absolutely
It
is.
is the top heavy realm of the lure at the top of the bank.
Oh, Andrew Kidman, I'll never forget. He is such a narrowbeam animal. You might think he lives out underneath the umbrella of Mount Warning, but when it comes down to it, he's such a narrow boy. Gets to Jeffreys Bay, it's pretty good. What's the first thing he does? The first thing is he refuses to paddle up the point. He's all of a sudden down the bottom of Narrabeen Car Park, last section of the lefts, but now they're rights. And he doggedly sits there and sits and sits and sits for most of 3 weeks, watching people paddle past him, getting more and more embittered, more cynical. It's so quixotic. He was winning battles by not catching a wave. But he was definitely in the spot. And when Slater first came to Jeffreys, he only sat there in heats. He never paddled up the line. He saw what Andrew saw, except with no one in the lineup now because of that beauty of the obvious, no one there. And in a perfect world, I'd try and end contest singlets. I'd try to end clearing the lineup. I'd open it. If there's an event, bugger it. You're all out there. If you're good enough to be a pro surfer, you are definitely good enough to hive waves.
Derek, your moment of describing the fishing gannets at J-Bay reminded me of the forgotten end of Darwin's theory of evolution, which
Go on.
had everything to do with cooperation as the greatest sign of fitness, right? Not competition, but cooperation, working together. Those of us that work together as a species have a much greater chance of survival.
Wow.
And so I'm hearing that in your imagining of how surfing might move forward.
And 170 years later, imagine if he was to come back and see the state of play.
To see how his ideas have been simplified and bastardized and used to justify all kinds of horrible things in the world.
So we were talking the other day, Derek, about that, the sort of militant competitive model and the collaborative cooperative model in surfing, and something Lauren and I were talking about since that moment at the beach was our curiosity towards your level of care and concern for surfing. And we're just wondering where that comes from. What's the motivator for you to give such a shit about this? Like, what is it about the subjectivity you've seen in judging and the directions in surfing and the nature of lineups and the histories that are told and everything? What motivates you to keep turning up and paying attention to that?
The beginnings of that would have been in early 1975 when about 8 of us started Newport Plus on the northern beaches of Sydney. Newport Plus was basically the remnants of Palm Beaches, Peninsula, North Avalons, Nassau, a bit of Bungan and a bit of Mona Vale. Both those upper end clubs were falling apart. Back then, the New South Wales club surfing scene was just massive. There were leagues, A-grade leagues and B-grade leagues. Ron Ware was a Byron identity, John O'Ware's father. Ron was the founder of NASA, and he saw it falling apart at the time. When I took, I guess, the job of running the club, from the outset, none of us were any good. This is when Tom was still 13, 14, Tom Carroll. Tom had only just paddled out the back for the first time, whilst his main rival, Alan French, had stayed in the shorey. And in those days, there were heaps of good shoreys. There was no need to really go out the back, except that the Kawasaki Mach 3 was now in vogue, and the guys that hitherto had dominated Newport Peak were into rockets to death instead. So there was a gap in the lineup. That's how the club started getting reasonable. The point of all this is, all of a sudden, a lot of us could catch waves at Newport Peak. Right from the beginning, something told me the underdog has to win a lot of heats here. The underdog deserves to win heats, so I'd always put 1 or 2 points handicap on the better the surfer. You're on 0, and then the young girl like Kay Jarman, or the guy 1 level down like Wayne Bale, they could easily steal a march on young Tom, which often happened. That's never really changed as the club started getting good, and we started getting quite a lot of us with international ratings. We found ourselves hanging with the same kind of disaffected clique within the then IPS tour. We'd all, and like Simon was one of these, Gary Timperley was, Greg Day, Mark Scott, Richo, Steve Wilson, Ted Deerhurst, on and on, Mike Newling. We'd always find quite a bit of black humour in what was going on, be it the seriousness of the competitors or the seeming crimes committed by judges. As it went on, I remembered how happy I'd been at age 17 when the first surfer bout was on at Narrabeen, to have seen Barry Kanaiapuni on a 2-foot wave in the rights, doing exactly what he did at 12-foot Sunset, on exactly the same board. It was just incredible pendulum surfing. Everyone who went to that event, it wasn't about the surfers, it was about the fan. They could return day after day and see BK all over again, do it one more time, and they could just dream of being in his footsteps. So surfing right from the outset, without it particularly knowing, was giving back to the fan. In 1991, way down the track, I ran an event at J Bay called the Dream Sequence that was based upon the 74 Surfer Bout. And there was just the one judge, but it was over multiple rounds. No one got beaten. And the one judge, there were two of them just rotating, but the one judge on site would simply put his thumb up if the guy was surfing as good as he could. It wasn't about being the best surfer. It was, if you're surfing as good as you can, then you're going to win this event, which directly brought locals like young Warren Dean and Mikey Mayer into the equation. They wouldn't have had a chance in hell in the past of winning such an event. But guaranteed, and I was really stoked when I reread something that Matt Hoy had written not so long ago about it being his favourite ever event, because there was just no pressure. You could warm up to what you wanted to do on a wave, planning 3 days down the track, I'll give it a shot, which is what, of course, MP used to do at Bell's. He'd warm into the points accumulation system and then, just like a horse at the trots, come from the back at the very end and take it out. So, getting back to the pass, someone might ride the wave of their life and look pretty damned awkward doing it, but I love watching Maximum Potential. It's just as good as it gets. So getting back to our conversation a few days back on the sand, I want something where elitism is just forgotten forevermore.
If you can't do that, what do you see happening in surfing?
No, I will do it. I'm certain I'm going to do it. It might take 10 years, but I think in 10 years' time, this countercultural perspective will not be countercultural any longer. There will be, say if generations of surfers are 3 years apart, there could be at least 2 generations growing up under the age of 10 wanting to do it a different way. Dad, no, Dad, I don't want to do it this way, Dad. I want to go that way, Dad.
Do you want to share anything about that you were talking with me about on the sand? Or is it too early days? Or hints of what it is?
Well, it's all being modified right now in my head, but everything moves in terms of the potential. And just for example, your lifestyle. You don't particularly want to be told to jump and move somewhere because there's going to be a, let's just say, a showcase somewhere, not an event. Well, let's forget about that. You've got a month to put something together, either at home or away. Submit it. And that's you. I was writing down modifying quite a serious list, and every person that I wrote down could easily take a month under specific instructions to stay at home on, say, the 2 best months of the year generally around the world, or travel without too much trouble with a friend and do the business. The return being just as strong as having to bow down to the system and travel with what has become almost a Stockholm Syndrome situation, being completely locked in to such an environment that it becomes the family, like it or not. That's the most dangerous thing about the tour, having to lock into an unnatural family. And it's not just whilst you're in there, it's when you have to break away from it.
Precisely. And also, I think one of the things that echoes that in my mind and experience is locking into the calendar and time. And to me, it's always seemed at odds that the surfers who have perhaps jumped into surfing more than any other people in the world and become, those peak performers or, the most celebrated surfers are actually now, at the height of that whole career, the most rigidly structured people in the surfing world. Their years are mapped out so precisely and so rigidly that, to me, that is also an indicator of kind of illness, or not illness, an indicator of there being a better way to do this.
We're being wonderfully diplomatic, which is laudable. However, what you've just described reminds me of that scene in Russell Crowe in Gladiator when into the cart they go, into the pen, and off to the next battleground they go. From the moment pro surfers pack a bag, they're in that Russell Crowe pen on their way to a battleground. It's not paying out. It's actually incredible what Slater's pulled off with his benefactor. It's stunning. When this chap was rewarded, I guess, not just awarded, with Waterman of the Year, it begged belief that they could do something as careless. But I had to pull myself up and go, but no, it's not, because like it or not, this is surfing. It really is right now the global home of surfing, because everyone's bought into the bubble. Well, the vast majority of people. Your style is irrelevant right now. My style is irrelevant. Lauren's style is completely irrelevant because style no longer exists within the confines of the global home of surfing. If this establishment, WSL, needs to push a barrow that far down the track, then all power to them, and I sincerely believe that. It's just, technologically, it's a great product. However, every year that passes, every year since 1982, when the ASP first came into play with Simon's thruster, pro surfing has become more and more exposed, more dangling in the wind. The great lesson that the sport didn't learn was from Surfer Magazine's newsstand sales in the late 80s. Whenever there was contest coverage mentioned on the cover, let alone a cover shot of a contest singlet, aside from Pipeline, the magazine barely sold. It was all about what Jack cottoned onto, Billabong Challenge, what I was into with the search. Neither event of which was designed as some sort of revolutionary riposte against the system. It was more, come on, there has to be some fun thrown in as well.
It makes me think about how surfers have rarely made sound decisions financially. And that makes me think specifically of the fact that women have been so frequently excluded from the story of surfing, often erased from the history of surfing. And even now, we make up as much as 30% of the surfing market in a place like the US. And yet When was the last time you saw a woman surfing on the cover of a magazine, or even included, in the pages of a surfing magazine? It's not really as frequently as one would think, considering that, there's lots of dollars to be made from including this other group of people.
If I've come across, say, 10 stories in the past 30 years about surfing, 4 would be about women that are just incredible. Either meeting them or hearing about the stories. Generally, when it comes to the Daniel Boone type getting out there, women seem far more capable of doing it. When it's Linda Cuy, C-U-Y, who went out with Dora for ages and told him to take a hike when he was being hunted down, and she was in her combi at Eastleigh Lefts, camped right there in a good functioning combi. Now, I briefly met her about 8 years later, still in the combi, completely eaten out, rusted like you couldn't believe, but still in the combi and still doggedly waiting for lefts. And when I asked her about, the left, she went, "Oh, no, I'm just parked here as a windbreak." And it was right next to the lefts. That's where it's at, which is the rights. And I saw her take off on a wave. And I've never seen Josette Lagadière surf, but I imagined that that'd be exactly the same as Josette would surf. Far less spasmodic movement than Dora, but the same type of
How many people have called Dora surfing spasmodic? Have you used that before? Oh, that's good.
No, but when I saw that first bottom turn she pulled on a longboard at Eastleigh Rights, the whole history of surfing came flooding back. Women's surfing was cruelled by the shortboard revolution, ripped apart. Until that time, sharing was welcomed. It was a wonderful thing to do because the entry speed, there was not much difference in entry speed. And back at the past now, surprising how many women actually have better entry speed than the guys. But Josette, Linda was one person that just left me completely stunned. Josette was another, because just in interviewing her a good 25 years ago at just on the other side of the Tweed, I could tell that she had the type of knowledge and perspective that you'd get out of Midget or Nat when they really wanted to sit down and just throw a few ideas out there. She knew just so much. The only person to ever be the Australian and the US champion. She just came out because Phyllis tuned her in about, a bit like Cooper and Greeno. Only it was Phyllis saying, "You got to see this, you won't believe it." So I never got to see Josette surf, but I imagine that she wouldn't be too far removed from Phyllis. And those two together were about the only two surfers on a lot of midweek days from about 68 to 71, when 3 rat bags were truanting school all the time. PT, MP bugs. Now you tell me how they got their styles, really. And how many times would you ever hear them mentioning Josette or Phyllis? Never, ever, ever. They'll lay a compliment on Druin, or they'll lay a compliment on Nat or Midget about the coat hang at bottom turn. But you're never going to get that as a compliment.
What is that? Is that misogyny? Is it ignorance? Is it
Yes.
uncool?
It's not going to school, yes. It's so many of those. Linda DeBoli. I think of Linda at least 3 times a week. I think of her more than Skip or Hank. And these are San Diego guys. Bert Huffman, Joe Roper. I think of Linda far more than those guys as to what mark she left on the sport, because she was the only surfer, perhaps arguably, I don't know, tell me another athlete in an ongoing pursuit who ever quit the moment he or she hit number one. She quit in Simon's year when he won Bells. She went, that's it, going home to Jersey to marry my mechanic. But she became a fantastic fisherman. You know, a fantastic fisherman. And then she's got a story of survival to end all stories, but it's got so much to do with surviving in Hawaii and just wonderful, wonderful power of survival, redemption, elevation.
So why do 99.99% of surfers have no idea who she is? Shouldn't her story be at, elevated to that sort of core, iconic, heroic level?
You know, there's a photo that either Rob Hutchinson or Hugh McLeod took of LD at Burley Cove in 79 or 80 in a bikini, doing the Fitzy hot buttered thing better than Fitzy ever could. Oh, it is just such a remarkable shot. She's got two testaments there to her own humble powers, quitting at the top and just demolishing Burley Cove that takes strips off every female surfer this side of Stephanie, and even Stephanie would have trouble laying a line that way. But again, we're just at that point in the late 70s recovering from 10 years of horror with designs for female surfers. You look at the history of female surfing in the 70s, generally speaking, it parallels the potato crisp style today with front out, back end out in order to get some semblance of balance going. Back then, when the contest boards started coming in, they were small, they were curvy, and they had to get a lower center to get them working. One of the reasons why women perhaps never recovered from the 70s in terms of universal appreciation is that the opportunity to shine then never arose, and there was almost no potential to hand down to the next generation what we've learnt. The rare birds were, no pun intended, the rare birds were people like Sherry Gross, when with her more vertical style, she'd take the Haleiwa, and she did the Haleiwa stuff that put her right up there with some of the best guys, no doubt about it.
I think what you're saying is so important, and it's a perspective that never really gets considered, and that is that the gap between men's and women's performance level can, to some degree, be put down to design.
Exactly. You know, the one huge fault with female surfing today is design, and it's because there's no midpoint of length. It's either I grow up riding contest boards or I will then adapt to riding a mal. A 6'5" to a 6'10" for a woman is just so perfect. Just to draw, because like Rel discovered, it's just that float on the higher third of the wave that allows stuff like this to happen.
100%. And actually, Lauren has an amazing board in her quiver shaped by Mark Andrini, an edge board off of George's Edge Designs. And it is that. It's like a 6'6", and it's just got a single fin, one of George's, very high aspect fins. And
interestingly, most men who get on it despise it.
They
can't
every
figure
man,
it out. Every
except
man who
one
gets
of
on
our
it,
friends.
especially you. You can't stand it. And every woman who gets on it goes,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
This paddles so well.
It glides. You can
so well.
highline.
It's so fast. It doesn't feel like
So
such hard work.
why not just switch the observation around to the horror of manhood?
Please explain.
the meat axe, the meat cleaver approach to surfing. If you can't hit it, if you can't drop an anvil from 10 stories and land on a wave and have it spray back, that's not surfing.
Yeah.
Masculinity
That's
hasn't
totally
been known
it.
for its subtlety.
It's fascinating, and it's fascinating that this board that Lauren has comes from the hands of Mark Andrini, but really the mind and the templates of George. And as someone who's tried George's edge boards for a few years, I'm having a break at the moment because I physically can't keep riding them for a while because I was getting hurt a lot trying to figure these things out. But one of the things that I learnt through the process of playing around with those boards with him was that his absolute disgust of throwing spray and carving a track in the wave and being the big hero guy who throws buckets of spray, which in his words is just drag and a show of ego force. And when you ride these edge boards, they do the exact opposite. They slice through the water in a way that's so the opposite of what he's talking about and what you're saying.
Rolls.
The meat axe, it just rolls gently. And if you try and overpower it and use your muscular system, it does what it always does to me, which just bucks me off. And I basically eat shit every time I try and do a strong bottom turn. And that's where the subtleness that we've seen through my sister and through Lauren, and I'm sure some other ladies have ridden that board, where that just thrives. That gentle touch really thrives.
It's quite interesting as well because a couple of times I paddled back out after a wave at Jeffrey's and someone that I haven't met has observed, "Hey mate, as you went past me, I heard something I'd never heard before." I went, "What's that?" And that's the sound I once heard at Thredbo, a hopeless skier, hopeless. And when Sonny Miller was one of the first to get into snowboarding, I kind of went, yeah, but it's soulless, it's got no style, you wobble over the place. But then I was going up the first T-bar at 10 to 8 trying to get the run down. And in the distance, I saw a figure coming right down along the line of the T-bar. And as he got closer, he was just flying. And it must have been, I don't know, a avalanche guy or just a snow patrol, but he was on a snowboard and he flew past me just going, and there was barely any chundering spray, but it was just, reminded me of Potter in 81 when he was going bank to bank to bank on those V panels. There's a time and a place for everything, but designs, the obvious is generally not the route to go.
I feel like we need to have another one of these conversations where we just zoom in specifically on the great untold stories of women surfing. Because to me, the stories that you've unearthed, Lauren, over the last 8 to 10 years or so of us being together, of these amazing women's stories, is that it feels like it's the tip of the iceberg, but they're all stories I've heard nothing about. And it's so, the level of adversity that women have had to triumph over, on top of then the physical feats, it's staggering.
There's no greater trial against adversity than Joey Hamasaki. Now, Tour Svensson had a lot of faults, but as the founder of Wind and Sea, both in San Diego and over at Bondi, he was a fountain of knowledge, and it's got to be said, skills. I asked him in 88 the best surfer he'd ever seen, and it was Joey Hamasaki. Didn't even mention a guy, even though he started Wind and Sea. He just went, Joey Hamasaki was so far ahead of the curve in 66 to 67. But she said something happened that to this day has never been spoken about, and she vanished.
These kinds of conversations make me feel really excited to hear some of the stories of the foremothers of women surfing, and also to unpack why women's approaches to riding waves have been belittled, diminished in comparison to what we've constructed as good, quote, good surfing. And I guess where I I'm going with this question is, what's the point of it? What is our goal on a wave?
Well, you have to abandon notions of performance. Women must abandon notions of that. Or guys must abandon notions of that too, actually. Gets back to birds, the line of birds.
So then how do we do it? So if we're looking into the coming years and we're saying, you know, say within 10 years there's this massive cultural shift where what was counterculture is just the norm, and this hyper-competitive, elitist scenario that we have with surfing right now is something in the past. How do we compare each other or acknowledge these performances or acknowledge these skills that people have in surfing without thieving our joy, you know, without comparison being the thief of joy? How do we do it?
Well said. There's no need for comparison. I think there are so many planes that surfers can feel themselves resting easily with down the track. Mick Campbell vanished off the tour when he won that world title but wasn't given the judges' benefit in Rio, and then re-emerged as a sponsored fisherman by the Mad Hueys. Not only that, but Talia Redguard, his girlfriend, I'd been told about her up at Noosa. I saw her do one turn. The girl who told me about Talia said that, quote, on the first wave she rode when we went for surf together, she aimed for me, hit the lip and flew over my head in a reverse. Landed it, kept surfing. YouTube. Go and YouTube Talia and Indo. That's all you got to do. Ultimately, people are going to have to supply material that's just wonderful. And no matter how many times you look at this thing, I'm stuttering. It's a great leap forward.
Yeah.
And it's that whole different plane though. This guy and this girl are just so into a lifestyle.
Yeah.
You know,
I just spent time with them down
Really?
in Streaky Bay.
Oh, what?
Last month.
They're down there.
Yeah, they're down there just having a time.
You know, it's like one's got a camera and then one goes out for a surf. Yeah, righto, I'll shoot. Come in.
Living in the troopy, sun-kissed, surf-stoned, stoked.
That's...
Very cool.
It's getting a little bit like Terminator 2 or whatever it was with, you know, it's after the apocalypse.
Yeah, or Mad Max,
yeah.
like that.
Oh, yeah. But, wow.
Yeah, well, I hear what you're saying, and it makes me think back to the other day when we did have a quick talk about seeing surfing through this sort of the musical lens, you know, and how there can be times in this area where there are other places in the past where you can discover a piece of sand that's roping on some corner, and there'll only be a handful of people that are aware of it, and that I've had sessions with a couple of crew from this area, like Raf and Ari Brown and Harry, and had, like I mentioned the other day, one surf in particular where there was 3 or 4 of us in the water, all riding completely different crafts, all looking for completely different lines on the waves and even completely different waves in that lineup. But I remember getting to the end of a wave, pulling off and then paddling back out up the kind of line of sand, like a point sort of set up, and watching someone come down the line in a completely different way that I had just ridden that wave, my previous wave, and that because there wasn't any comparison, it was so different. There was no envy or jealousy or judgment or measuring up against or any of that there. It was simply, holy shit, how was that line in that critical part of the wave? Or how did that person go 20 feet out from the flats, you know, without fins in that situation, with a board with so much flex, bend the rocker into it, and then just slingshot up to the lip. And it was still one of the most enjoyable moments of surfing, shared surfing, in this area that I can ever remember. And to me, that's a great example of what you're talking about becoming the norm in the future, where every lineup could have that type of collaborative, not even collaborative, it's just cooperative and never competitive moment well, that would be my dream anyway, where you just literally in symphony with each other. That person on that board is bouncing off the notes that you're putting down with your type of instrument and your type of line.
It's bouncing off of air currents, diving one after another, but each taking a different line to get there.
Yeah, so the reason I get enthusiastic about what you're talking about, Derek, is because I've had those little snippets of that experience and seen, and even on trips that we've done, like when we went to the Maldives a few years ago with a little interesting group of surfers and really experimenting with, gifting waves and making sure every person was gifting waves at least to one other person in the lineup and just passing things, like just looking for new dynamics and lineups.
In the pragmatic sense, what we were discussing a few days ago probably couldn't have happened 2, 3 or 4 years ago, because hipsters are vanishing so fast. But back then, they were so all over anything that had a sniff of change, they were just going to rape it, excuse the French. But without the hipster phenomenon to contend with anymore, it really seems like an easy step to move elsewhere without it being ravaged too fast. It can breathe. One can hope.
I loved Derek's story about the gannets. He has so many eccentric, wild tales, but he chose something so simple and accessible and ordinary, but also mystical.
Majestical, even.
We were just talking about the mystic state the other night. Remember, we were watching the George Harrison documentary, Living in the Material World. You asked, do you regularly have mystical experiences?
Yeah.
I thought that was a great question.
Well, do you?
And I told you that I feel like surfing offers a lot of mystical moments. It's not something that I can conjure. It's just, there's like a moment where everything clicks into place and all your muscles are working in unison and you feel strong and aligned and the sun is shining and you feel the warmth on your skin and moving through water as this singular being but melting into the ocean at the same time, and deep interconnection that are just mystical. They
almost sound like a quantum physicist.
It just
talking
feels
about particle
purely
and wave.
beautiful. It just feels purely beautiful. And that's one of the great, great gifts of surfing for me, especially because it cannot be forced. It's just a moment that falls into place, sometimes on the most ordinary day.
Well, that sounds pretty mystical. And Derek's one of just gannets diving and observing them in Australia or observing them at J-Bay, in that amazing vision of a gannet tornado or gannet water spout going up into the sky and then tumbling down in the center of the spout into the ocean and spiraling back up. That's just such a beautiful image. It really sends me back to my childhood and learning from Dick Van Stralen about just paying attention to the whole symphony that's going on in surfing. The riding of the wave is just sort of like one melody that one little instrument plays in a moment, but it's part of a whole big symphony that's going on. And some of those other moments are actually the majority. That wave riding moment is pretty small. Derek's a real master of that, where I've done trips with him in the past where I've heard him say that everything's anticipation. And so we would do these missions, absolute missions in Chile, getting lost and driving long time to get to our destination, finally getting there. The surf's cracking and we're all delirious, and to the final moment before getting into the water at the lineup, Derek is just bouncing, just buzzing and buzzing and buzzing. And then the surfing happened, but it wasn't that big of a deal. It was all that lead up. And I remember having that experience with him when I was kind of late teenager or early 20s, I think, and it being pretty impactful. And for me, that was all brought back to the surface when he was talking about gannets, and talking about a moment where he was never the same after. And that was that for him. And this is a guy who's done like 20 360s on a wave at J-Bay at full speed, or has experimented with so many different designs over the decades and felt so many things that very few surfers have ever felt. But the gannets is what came to his mind.
Isn't that such a testament to the beauty of an intergenerational relationship?
Yeah.
Having elders in your life, people that you go on adventures with.
Yeah, exactly.
How cool is that?
Yeah. So wonderful that we have someone like Derek in our surfing culture to push the edges, usually. I feel like that's really where he's thriving from the outside. For those of us looking at him, we're like, wow, that cat's always on the edge of something. Surfing, he's on the edge of spinning out and blowing out, or on the edge of just disappearing down the wormhole of finlessness, or, on the edge of something in travel and obscure surf locations.
Yeah, Gloria Steinem says revolution keeps you young. And I feel like that's so Derek. He keeps reinventing himself and his experience of surfing, and you can just see it. He's got such a bright, youthful spark about him all the time. It's super inspiring to see someone hold on to that into elder age and really show us how to make a surfing life last. Thanks again to Derek for his wisdom and bright mind. You can learn more about Derek on Instagram at farfieldfreefriction. Special thanks to our sound engineer, Shannon Soul Carroll. You can find his music via shannonsoulcarroll.bandcamp.com and learn more about his gigs and musical activism on Instagram at shannonsoulcarroll. On behalf of myself, Lauren Hill, and my partner in rhyme, Dave Rastovich, thank you for making the time to listen with us. We'll be continuing the conversation on Instagram, where we're at Water People Podcast. You can find show notes and links from each episode on our website, waterpeoplepodcast.com.